Matt Kean, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David. Thank you for having me.
Well, I suspect most federal cabinet ministers probably do know who you are now. Can I ask at the start here, have you spoken to the Prime Minister since that exchange last year and indeed in the lead up to the Glasgow summit?
Yes, of course I've spoken to the Prime Minister. I want to see the Prime Minister lead the world when it comes to taking action on climate change because it's in our economic interest to do so. We know that there's an economic arms race underway for the next generation of jobs, investments, export opportunities and economic prosperity. And I want to see Australia at the head of the pack to grab those opportunities and set us up for a more prosperous future.
So what would you like to see him take to Glasgow?
What I'd like to see him take to Glasgow is obviously a net zero commitment by 2050, but also an ambitious interim commitment by 2030. And there's a very
What does ambitious mean?
Well, I think at the very least, the Prime Minister should take the average targets of all the states and territories here in Australia, which would be around a 35% target. The idea that you can have just a projection doesn't stack up for all of us who think that we should take climate change seriously and think that there are huge economic opportunities in doing so. A projection without a target for 2030 basically says we don't take climate change seriously or we don't trust our projections or the policies to get there.
Are you suggesting here that if the Prime Minister doesn't do that, we miss out on those economic opportunities?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting. We know that 70% of Australia's two-way trade is with countries that have committed to hit net zero emissions by 2050. That means the markets that have underwritten our prosperity for generations are starting to change the goods, resources and energy supplies that they're going to request from Australia. And the thing is that in a low-carbon global economy, there's nowhere better place to take advantage of these opportunities than Australia. We've got some of the best renewable resources anywhere on the planet. Those renewable energy resources can be used to support heavy industry in creating things like green aluminium, green steel, and also provide the world's energy needs in a low-carbon future, like producing green hydrogen, which we're really well placed to do.
Well, we've just been discussing the difficulty the Prime Minister faces in bringing the Nationals on board, not just with the net zero by 2050, but certainly a more ambitious interim term target. In New South Wales, your Liberal National Government have embraced a 50% target by 2030. How were you able to do this and why can't the federal coalition?
Well, I'm a coalitionist, and what we did was work to find common ground with the coalition, and that was developing policies that would reduce our carbon emissions but grow our economy, reduce our carbon emissions but create jobs, drive investment, largely into the regions. So we worked constructively finding those opportunities where we could reduce our carbon emissions but not add increases to cost of living, create new jobs and drive investment into rural and regional New South Wales. Take, for example, our renewable energy zones. That's basically the modernisation of our electricity system, and that will see about $32 billion worth of private capital going into rural and regional Australia. That means jobs, that means opportunities, and an investment boom like the regions have never seen before in this state.
The concern, though, certainly for the Nationals, is those who work in the coal industry or in heavy industry that rely on cheap, reliable power. So how have you addressed that? Because it's not like you have a shortage of coal, in industry in New South Wales. I think it makes up, 80% of the energy mix at the moment in New South Wales. So how have you addressed that concern and the concern for the tens of thousands of workers who are either directly or indirectly employed by the coal industry in your state?
Well, we understand that those coal jobs, those coal communities are going to be impacted by decisions of foreign governments and foreign companies. So we need to prepare for that future. That's a future which has the major coal export markets that we send our product to moving to a low carbon future. So we need to start to think about how we diversify those economies, how we safeguard those jobs into the future and how we set the regions up for a more prosperous, successful future.
So what does that look like though? What does that look like practically? For those workers in coal right now?
That means looking to invest in the creation of new industries like hydrogen. For example, we know that Japan and South Korea, two key coal export markets for New South Wales, have said hydrogen is going to be the fuel that's going to power their economy in the future. And we can produce that hydrogen, ship it to Japan and South Korea, and do so by creating jobs and investment opportunities in the Hunter and the Illawarra.
Those jobs aren't there right now.
Coal-exposed communities.
Those jobs aren't there right now. They may be, hopefully soon, but they're not there right now. And, there's scepticism around this. Last month, nearly 80 workers at the state's largest coal mine, the Mount Arthur, the BHP mine there, were told either to resign or transfer interstate. And some said they felt chucked in the gutter. Where was the support for them?
Well, denying the reality of what's happening internationally is not an answer to this problem. And this is about making sure that we're honest with the Australian public, explaining exactly the risks that are happening because of these global megatrends and preparing ourselves for what the future look like.
I understand that, but what are you doing for these workers who are losing their jobs right now?
What we're doing is supporting those workers in those industries at the present, but we're also building a diversified economy for the future, an economy whereby those skills and those workers are easily transferable to new industries and new opportunities that are going to be needed to supply the world's energy needs as we move to a low-carbon economy.
So what help did these workers get?
Well, we're investing heavily in skills and training. We're building new industries in those coal-exposed communities like the Hunter and the Illawarra, like the hydrogen industry. We're investing $3 billion to turbocharge the hydrogen industry in the Hunter and the Illawarra, which will create hundreds and thousands of jobs. It will create unbelievable prosperity and see investment coming into the regions like we've never seen before.
You've mentioned hydrogen and renewables a lot there. Can I ask you about gas? The federal government's spending $600 million on a new gas plant at Kurri Kurri. Is that needed?
Well, gas has a role to play in manufacturing, certainly in the short term, but if you're moving to a low-carbon future, then gas is not going to be needed.
What about this plant? Is this plant needed?
I think this plant has a role to play in supporting the transition to renewables in the short term, but I don't want to see us investing in things that could be a white elephant. I want to see us investing in the things that are going to grow our productivity and grow our prosperity and set us up for a better future. And that's exactly why we've got the Renewable Energy Infrastructure Plan, the most ambitious renewable energy infrastructure plan in the nation. So we're doubling down on that, David.
Okay, but this plan, this Kurri Kurri plant is okay? You support that, or is that a white elephant?
Well, it's the Commonwealth Government's money. We're not going to knock back $600 million worth of investment. We think that the gas peaking plant will help at the margins in helping us transition to that renewable energy future. But, if they want to spend $600 million of taxpayer money on a gas plant, which I don't think will have a long-term future in New South Wales, then knock themselves out.
Doesn't sound like you'd be doing it.
We're not doing it. We've got our energy infrastructure roadmap, which is focusing on renewable energy, making sure, and we're doing it in a way that's going to drive down electricity bills in New South Wales. Our energy infrastructure plan will drive down household bills by on average $130 per household and by on average $430 for businesses across this state. So it's going to reduce our emissions, but also drive down household bills and grow our economy.
What about nuclear? Some nationals want legislation change to at least allow nuclear power to be considered in Australia. Would that ever be allowed in New South Wales?
Well, I mean, these people pursuing nuclear, it is like pursuing a fantasy. The reality is it doesn't stack up at the moment on practical grounds or on economic grounds. Nuclear energy is about 2 to 3 times more expensive than coal, and which is multiple times more expensive than renewables backed up by storage. With regard to the practicality of nuclear, the Chief Scientist of New South Wales ran the UK Ministry of Defence's nuclear program in the United Kingdom, and he says it will take at least 15 years just to upskill the workforce ready to be able to run a nuclear program. And in that time, we've lost 4 of our 5 coal-fired power stations here in New South Wales. So people talking about nuclear to solve our current needs are chasing a unicorn. It may have a role to play in the future as technology evolves, so I'm not going to rule that out. But right now, we're focusing on the things that are going to work, that are going to drive down bills, create jobs and grow our economy.
Just before I leave the climate issue, if the Prime Minister, you said you're a coalitionist, but if the Prime Minister can't get the Nats on board, what's your message to him? What should he do?
Well, the Prime Minister needs to continue to act in the nation's interest. And if the Nats don't want to get on board, then they've got a very clear choice. They can resign from the ministry and support a coalition, a Liberal government. They can resign from the ministry or they can resign from the ministry and support a Labor government. Now, I know what the best path forward for our country is, and that's a strong national Liberal coalition government putting the interests of our nation first. That's what we've done in New South Wales, and I know that that's what will happen in Canberra.
Let me turn to some other issues, because climate isn't the only area where we're seeing the New South Wales government at least trying to lead some national reform. House prices, they've been skyrocketing through this pandemic. Is this a problem, and what should be done about it?
Housing affordability is a huge problem, but the major reason we've got a housing affordability issue at the moment is because we've got record low interest rates. So we need to make sure that we're putting in place policies that will make access to home ownership affordable for everyone, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't destroy the wealth of existing homeowners. So nothing is off the table here. We're looking at a range of options, and as the new Treasurer of New South Wales, that's certainly a key area of focus for me.
Are you looking at housing supply, which is one area the states are responsible for, because it doesn't look like New South Wales is keeping up with housing supply. Your own Treasury Department says you need, quote, an average of 42,000 additional homes to be added to the housing stock every year. Why isn't that happening?
Well, of course, we'll look at all the policy levers we have available to us to ensure that first homeowners can enter the market. We want to ensure that everyone has access to that great Australian dream of home ownership. But we want to do so in a way that's not going to destroy the wealth of existing homeowners. So as the new
Will you boost supply, though? Will you boost housing supply?
Of course, we'll look at all options to ensure that first homeowners can get access to the market, and that includes boosting home supply.
Despite these problems with housing affordability and indeed housing supply, we've heard the Premier, Dominic Perrottet, say you also want to increase the migration intake. He's talking about a big New South Wales. Just how big, and what pressure would that put on housing?
Well, skilled migration has been key to the economic success of this country for generations, and we should continue to ensure that it remains key to our success for generations ahead. So we obviously are suffering for some major skills shortages, major labour force shortages at the moment as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic. We need to get skilled labour and immigrant labour back into this country as soon and as safely as possible.
But how big do you want New South Wales to be?
Big enough to ensure that we're able to continue to raise our living standards, continue to be one of the most prosperous and successful nations anywhere on the planet.
Finally, the GST. Are you in favour of broadening the base of the GST and increasing the rate?
What I'm in favour of is ensuring that New South Wales gets its fair share, but what I will say is that my focus as the Treasurer is in undertaking the productivity reforms that are going to raise not only our state's living standards, but the nation's living standards and prosperity.
Does that include increasing the rate and broadening the base of the GST?
Well, we will work with the Commonwealth to deliver a better outcome for the citizens of New South Wales.
What's your view
and
as
act in
Treasurer?
the national interest.
What's your view as State Treasurer now on the GST?
Well, let me be very clear. We need to make sure that New South Wales gets its fair share of GST.
Understand that.
How the Commonwealth goes about that is their business. But let me say this. The area that I want to focus on as the Treasurer is the productivity reforms that are needed to drive this country forward, like getting a higher female participation rate in the workforce. We need to tackle childcare so that women don't have to choose between having a career and having a family.
OK, and that's all fair enough, but I'm just after a clear answer on the GST rate and the base. Is that something you want to change or not?
I'm not in favour of higher taxes, David. I'm in favour of making sure that taxes are equitable and are working in our nation's economic interest. So I'll work with the Commonwealth Treasurer to ensure that's the case. OK,
so you're not echoing your predecessor, Dominic Perrottet, as Treasurer, who did want to address GST reform?
We obviously need GST reform to ensure that places like New South Wales get their fair share. But what I'm saying to the Commonwealth is we want to work with them and we want them to invest in New South Wales undertaking the productivity enhancing reform that's going to not only drive New South Wales forward, but drive the country forward and expand the budget.
New South Wales Treasurer and Environment Minister Matt Kean, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David.